The story does not begin with a scream. It begins with a knock. Sicily, mid-17th century. A city thriving on trade, faith, and silence. In a narrow passageway where prayers go unanswered and walls have ears, a woman walks as though death itself is following one step behind her. She moves quickly, purposefully. Her clothing marks her as wealthy, imported fabric, careful tailoring, yet her posture betrays her. Shoulders tight, head lowered. A dark veil hides her face, but it cannot hide the urgency in her stride. This is not a woman shopping for bread. This is not a woman visiting a friend. She has come to purchase something far more dangerous. She stops before a door indistinguishable from all the others. Rotten wood, flaking paint, no sign, no symbol, and yet everyone knows. This is where hope comes when God refuses to answer. She raises her hand. 3 knocks. The door opens only slightly. From the darkness inside, a pair of eyes studies her, sharp, measuring, ancient with experience. The face behind them remains hidden, but the voice is steady and unafraid. What troubles you, child? The woman in black swallows. She does not speak of the bruises hidden beneath silk sleeves. She does not confess to the man who owns her name, her money, her body, the man who drinks away her dowry and returns home with violence in his hands. She does not say that he has promised her death if she ever seeks escape. Instead, she recites the lie that has saved countless lives. My mother is very ill. She suffers greatly. I need something to ease her final days. The eyes in the darkness do not blink. The door opens wider. Standing before her is a woman well past her youth, silver threaded through dark hair, skin lined by time and secrets. Yet there is an unmistakable beauty about her. Not the beauty of softness, but of certainty. This is Giulia Tofana, and she has heard this sentence more times than she can remember. The room beyond the door is small and dim. Candlelight dances across. Stone walls. The air is heavy with crushed herbs, dried petals, something sweet, something medicinal. On a wooden table sits an arrangement of glass vials, elegant, delicate, almost devotional. Each bottle is hand-painted with saints and halos, angels frozen mid-blessing. Objects meant to inspire trust, reverence, faith. They look like relics, like perfume, like salvation. They are none of those things. Giulia selects one vial with careful fingers. Its label bears a saint's name, written in gentle script, a promise of mercy, protection, holiness. She places it into the trembling hands of the veiled woman. 4 drops, no more than 6. Mix it with his wine, his broth, anything he consumes. There is no taste, no scent, no trace. He will weaken slowly. Fever, fatigue, perhaps the heart. Physicians will find nothing. They always call it the will of God. The woman clutches the vial. Her hands shake, not with fear, but with something far more dangerous. Hope. She sets a heavy purse on the table. Coins spill softly, dull gold catching the light. A fortune, enough to feed families for months. How long? Slowly is survival. A few drops over many days. Weeks, if needed. If you rush, people notice. And noticed women do not live long. The warning hangs between them. The woman nods. She presses the bottle to her chest as though it were sacred, an object capable of miracles, and disappears back into the city, swallowed by the crowds. Another ghost among thousands. Another secret Palermo will never speak aloud. Giulia watches the doorway for a long moment. Then she closes it. She returns to the table and rests her fingers against the remaining vials, one by one. Each identical, each deadly. Every bottle is a key to a locked marriage, a key to a violent man's final sleep, and depending on who tells the story, a mercy or a mortal sin. Before this story goes any further, there is something you must understand. If you believe the past is only made of kings and wars, then this story will unsettle you. But if you believe that the darkest corners of history still breathe, that forgotten women, stripped of voice and choice, found ways to fight back, then you are already standing at the threshold of something dangerous. Because some histories were never meant to survive. They were buried deliberately, whispered only behind locked doors. This journey into secrecy, poison, and quiet rebellion continues only because those shadows are dragged into the light. And tonight, we open the door fully. Tonight, we step inside a shop that sold no perfumes, only endings. This is the life of Giulia Tofana, from her roots in Sicily's criminal underbelly to her rise as the most effective poisoner history has ever known. We will follow the trail of bodies left behind, hundreds of men erased without a scream. We will uncover the network of women who shielded her, protected her, and spread her secret from city to city. And finally, we will arrive at the courtroom where her invisible empire collapsed. This is not simply the tale of a murderer. It is the story of power and what happens when those denied it discover a weapon no one can see. Justice or vengeance, sealed inside a bottle disguised as faith. This is the story of the woman said to have ended 600 lives, one drop at a time. To understand the woman history would later fear, you must first understand the world that created her. Giulia Tofana was not born into comfort. She did not inherit safety, status, or protection. She was born into a reality where survival was a daily calculation and where women existed under absolute control. This was a world where women had no legal voice, no right to leave, no authority over their own lives. Marriage was not partnership. It was ownership. Divorce was not forbidden. It was unthinkable. A woman bound to a violent husband had only three paths: endure the abuse, flee, and be hunted, or kneel and pray for death. But long before Giulia offered a fourth option, another woman already had. Her name was Tanya D'Adamo. She lived in Palermo in the late 16th century, a city of staggering contrasts. Golden churches rose beside starving alleys. Faith ruled absolutely. Cruelty hid behind sanctity. Tanya was a widow. How she became one was a matter no one pressed too hard to uncover. After her husband's convenient passing, she did not remarry. Instead, she turned inward, to knowledge far older than the church approved of. She became known as a healer. She treated headaches, fever, women's ailments spoken only in whispers. But soon, women began arriving with a different kind of sickness, one that wore boots, one that smelled of wine, one that returned home angry. Tanya listened. She never judged. She never asked too many questions. And when the moment came, she would slide a small vial across the table, clear as water, without scent, without taste. She never explained what it was. She didn't need to. The women understood. Weeks later, their husbands would weaken. A fever, a trembling heart, a slow collapse that looked like God's will in an age where death required no explanation. Doctors were baffled. Priests found no sin to confess, and no one thought to accuse a grieving wife. For years, Tanya practiced in silence. Her protection was not wealth or guards. It was secrecy. The women she helped never spoke of it. Not in confession, not to officials, not even to each other beneath the sun. Because in Palermo, silence was survival. And in that silence, a daughter was watching. Secrets survive in whispers, in rooms sealed tight against daylight, passed from mouth to ear by people who know that being overheard means death. But no secret, no matter how carefully guarded, remains buried forever. In 1633, the silence shattered. Tanya D'Adamo was arrested. No records tell us exactly how the chain broke. Perhaps a priest heard a final confession whispered by a dying man, a truth too heavy for even the seal of the confessional. Perhaps fear overcame loyalty. Perhaps envy sharpened a rival's tongue. History does not agree. What history does agree on is what followed. She was tried. She was found guilty. And she was executed. The method was strangulation. Slow, intimate, deliberate. No blade, no spectacle, just breath stolen inch by inch. And when it was over, mercy did not follow. Her body was thrown into a convent courtyard in Palermo, not laid to rest. Displayed. A warning. A message carved into flesh and silence. This is what happens to women who try to unlock their chains. But death did not end her legacy. Because Tanya D'Adamo did not die alone. She left behind a daughter. A young woman who watched soldiers tear her mother from their home. Who saw her dragged through the streets like a criminal spectacle. Who learned every secret, every measurement, every precaution before the knock ever came. Her name was Giulia, and she inherited more than knowledge. She inherited purpose. After the execution, Giulia understood one truth with absolute clarity. Palermo was no longer safe. The church would watch her. The authorities would remember her name. In a world where guilt stained entire bloodlines, a daughter could be punished for a mother's sins. So Giulia did the only thing that ensured survival. She vanished. She fled north to Naples, one of the largest, loudest, most chaotic cities in Italy. A place where anonymity thrived, where faces blurred together, where truth could be buried beneath reinvention. If Palermo was a small room full of listening ears, Naples was a maze. And Giulia did not arrive there to hide. She arrived to evolve. Naples was a city of impossible contrast. Art and music flourished beside starvation. Church bells rang over streets thick with violence. The wealthy barricaded themselves behind stone walls while the poor fought for survival below. And everywhere, in every class, in every quarter, there were women locked inside marriages that were slowly killing them. Giulia saw what her mother had seen. Need. Opportunity. She began quietly. A small rented room. A modest neighborhood. A carefully crafted identity. A widow. Respectable. Devout. She sold cosmetics. Skin treatments. Herbal remedies. She attended mass. She smiled at neighbors. She listened more than she spoke. Trust grew naturally. And in the shelter of that trust, the work resumed. But Giulia was not content to repeat history. Her mother had been caught. That fact haunted her. Somewhere, something in Tanya's method had failed. A trace. A pattern. A whisper that traveled too far. Giulia knew survival required perfection. If she was going to succeed, she needed to disappear completely. She needed a poison that left no fingerprint. No suspicion. No trail. She needed something invisible. What Giulia Tofana created in those early years would become one of the most feared substances in European history. A poison so subtle it would take hundreds of lives over decades while remaining virtually unknown. She called it Aqua Tofana. To the eye, it was nothing. Water clear, odorless, tasteless. Its genius lay in its simplicity. Carefully prepared arsenic, refined lead, belladonna, deadly nightshade. Each ingredient purified, measured precisely, combined with patience and restraint. Taken alone, each substance was known. Together, they became something else entirely. A slow death, a natural death, a death no doctor could name. It looked like water, and that was the most terrifying part. To the untrained eye, it was harmless. It could pass for holy water drawn from a consecrated font, for rose water dabbed on the wrists, for an innocent tonic meant to calm the nerves. But inside those fragile bottles was death itself. Not loud, not violent, patient. The genius of Aqua Tofana was not merely that it could not be seen. It was that it waited. Giulia understood something most killers never grasp. A sudden death invites questions. A dramatic collapse demands attention. But a slow decline is accepted. It is forgiven. It is called fate. One drop did nothing. Perhaps a headache. A moment of nausea easily ignored. 2 or 3, spaced carefully across days, brought a fever. Fatigue. A heaviness in the chest. Doctors nodded knowingly. Prescribed rest. Offered useless remedies. And then, weeks later, 4 to 6 drops finished the work. Strength drained away. Organs failed quietly. No convulsions. No drama. Just a slow extinguishing. A weak heart. A sudden illness. The will of God. And beside him, a grieving widow dressed in black. She would inherit everything. No investigation. No suspicion. No trace left behind. At least none that 17th century medicine could recognize. It was the perfect murder. And Giulia Tofana was the only person alive who knew how to create it. But she was not reckless. Giulia did not sell death to just anyone. She understood the danger of visibility, understood that survival required structure. So she did what all enduring powers do. She organized. Giulia Tofana was not merely a poisoner. She was a strategist, a gatekeeper, and in her own unsettling way, a protector. She knew she could not stand alone. She needed a network, women bound not by blood, but by secrecy, a sisterhood forged in desperation. It began with those who came directly to her, women who arrived shaking, bruised beneath silk, desperate but intelligent. Giulia listened carefully, not just to their suffering, but to who they were. Could they keep a secret? Could they follow instructions? Could they survive freedom? Only then did she decide. If she trusted them, she gave them the poison. But she also gave them something else, a warning and a promise. The warning was absolute. Tell no one, not a sister, not a mother, not a priest. If you are discovered, you stand alone. The promise was equally clear. If you succeed, if you live, and if another woman comes to you in despair, you will know where to send her. And so the web expanded. A widow in Naples murmured to a friend traveling north. A woman in Rome spoke quietly to a cousin in Florence. Each referral careful, each trust earned. No one knew Giulia's true name. No one knew her address. They only knew someone existed. The network developed its own language. No one ever asked for poison. They spoke of sick relatives, of suffering mothers, of mercy. They mentioned saints. They asked for manna, bread from heaven. Those who understood answered. The distributors were often widows themselves, women who had already crossed the line, women who had paid the price, women who now helped others escape. They sold the liquid disguised as cosmetics, as holy water, as medicine. The bottles were beautiful, painted with saints and angels, gilded in gold. Objects no man would ever question. And their greatest protection was not secrecy alone. It was solidarity, the silence of women who had everything to lose. This was not merely a criminal operation. It was a rebellion concealed in devotion. In a world where women had no legal power, no right to leave, no shield against violence, Giulia Tofana gave them one thing: choice. But power, even power born of survival, leaves a trail. For years, the deaths passed unnoticed. Husbands fell ill. Widows mourned convincingly. Estates changed hands. Giulia accumulated wealth, not for luxury, but for mobility, independence, safety. Yet in Naples, in Rome, in cities beyond, the numbers began to whisper. Dozens became scores. Scores became hundreds. Too many. Similar deaths. And slowly, quietly, a question formed. Why were so many husbands dying? And why did their wives always seem ready? A priest began to wonder. A physician hesitated before signing a death record. A grieving son refused to believe his father's passing was divine will. The shadows were stirring, and the light was coming. The authorities were not listening yet, but they would, because no shadow, no matter how carefully shaped, can outrun the light forever. Giulia Tofana's network had been flawless, her poison invisible, her methods patient. Yet history obeys only one rule. Everything surfaces, and when the truth finally broke through, it would rattle all of Italy. The question was never if she would be discovered, only how many would die before she was. Rome. The year is 1659. The Eternal City, seat of the Pope, heart of Christendom, a place where marble churches rose like monuments to God, and where men came to bargain with heaven. Pilgrims arrived seeking salvation. Powerful families came seeking favor. And beneath the polished holiness, something was rotting. Men were dying, not in battle, not in riots, not even from plague, though plague was never far away. These deaths were quieter, more intimate. A merchant complained of headaches. A nobleman developed a fever that refused to break. A banker grew pale and thin, wasting away week by week. Physicians shrugged. They spoke of corrupted humors, of weak hearts, of divine mystery. And then, inevitably, the man died. In the 17th century, death was common. But something about these deaths felt wrong. What followed unsettled Rome far more than the funerals. The widows did not behave as expected. Tradition demanded a year of mourning. Black garments, isolation, visible grief. These women complied briefly. They cried at the graves. They prayed publicly. And then, far too soon, they reemerged. Alive, focused, prepared. They seized control of businesses, sold properties, claimed inheritances with confidence. Some remarried quickly, but not to tyrants. Others refused remarriage altogether, choosing independence in a world that barely tolerated it. They looked less like victims and more like survivors. Priests noticed. Families noticed. Whispers spread, cautious and fearful. Were these women too calm? Too capable? Too relieved? But suspicion without proof is nothing more than rumor. And in Rome, a city drowning in rumor, nothing changed. The deaths continued. The widows multiplied. And Giulia Tofana, hidden among them, grew bolder. She had arrived years earlier, following the paths carved by her network. Naples had become dangerous, too familiar. Rome was vast, anonymous, overflowing with women who needed her. And here, Giulia committed her most audacious act yet. She based her operation inside a church. Santa Maria in Portico. Modest, respected, unremarkable to the casual eye. Giulia was a familiar presence there. A devout widow, first at morning mass, generous with donations, active in charity. The priests trusted her. The congregation admired her. She appeared to embody Christian virtue. But Giulia understood something few dared to exploit. A church was not just a house of God. It was sanctuary. Under sacred law, civil authorities could not arrest someone on holy ground. Only the church itself could surrender a criminal, and it rarely did. Giulia hid behind faith itself. Within Santa Maria in Portico, she maintained a small private room. Officially, a place for prayer, for counsel, for comfort. In truth, it was her workshop, her marketplace, her command center. Women arrived under the guise of devotion. They knelt in pews, crossed themselves, lowered their voices. They confessed sins not to priests, but to Giulia. Behind closed doors, they spoke of beatings, of humiliation, of husbands who drank away their futures and threatened their lives. Giulia listened with the patience of a confessor. She did not interrupt. She did not judge. And then, calmly, she reached for a bottle. Manna of St. Nicholas, she would say. A blessing for those who suffer. The women understood. They hid the bottle beneath their robes, lowered their heads in false prayer, and they left the church, carrying salvation that came not from heaven, but from poison. Rome continued to pray, and men continued to die. The city was not listening yet, but it would, because no matter how carefully a secret is buried, no matter how deep the silence, it always cracks. Giulia Tofana's design had been flawless, her web unbroken, her poison unseen. Still, nothing escapes the light forever. And when illumination finally reached her hidden dominion, the shock would ripple across all of Italy. The question was never whether she would be found, only how many would vanish before she was. Rome, 1659, the Eternal City, seat of the Pope, center of faith, power, and judgment. A place where marble saints watched silently as pilgrims begged for salvation and rulers bargained with heaven itself. Yet beneath the polished holiness, something was wrong. Men were dying, not on battlefields, not in riots, not even in waves of plague, though disease was always lurking. These deaths were quieter, too quiet. A merchant complained of persistent pain. A nobleman burned with a fever that refused every remedy. A banker faded day by day, his flesh thinning, his color draining, his strength dissolving. Physicians muttered familiar explanations, corrupted humors, a frail constitution, the unknowable will of God. And then, inevitably, the man was gone. Death itself was not unusual. What followed was, the widows did not behave as expected. Custom demanded prolonged grief, months cloaked in black, public sorrow, withdrawal from life. These women complied briefly. They stood at the funerals. They prayed. They wept when eyes were upon them. And then, far too soon, they returned to the world. Changed. They assumed command of businesses, liquidated estates, collected inheritances with unsettling efficiency. Some remarried quickly, but this time on their own terms. Others refused marriage altogether, choosing independence in a society that barely tolerated it. They did not look broken. They looked prepared. Priests noticed. Families noticed. Questions surfaced, cautiously, fearfully. Were these women too composed? Too ready? Too free? But suspicion without evidence is nothing more than noise. And Rome was drowning in noise. The deaths continued. The widows multiplied. And Giulia Tofana, hidden among them, grew confident. She had arrived years earlier, following the veins of her own creation. Naples had grown dangerous, too small, too aware. Rome was endless, anonymous, overflowing with suffering women. And here, Giulia made her boldest move. She rooted herself inside faith itself. Santa Maria in Portico, unassuming, respected, blending seamlessly into Rome's sacred landscape. Giulia was known there, a devoted widow, present at dawn mass, generous with alms, active in charity. The priests trusted her. The faithful admired her. She embodied virtue. But Giulia understood a truth few dared exploit. A church was more than a place of worship. It was untouchable ground. Under sacred law, secular authorities could not seize a suspect within its walls. Only the church could surrender one of its own, and it almost never did. Faith itself became her shield. Within the church, Giulia maintained a small private chamber. Officially, a space for prayer, for counsel, for comfort. In reality, it was her workshop, her exchange, her nerve center. Women arrived disguised as penitents. They knelt, crossed themselves, whispered their confessions, but not to priests. To Giulia. Behind closed doors, the stories spilled out. Fists, threats, infidelity. Men who drank, gambled, and promised death to any wife who dared speak of escape. Giulia listened without interruption, patient, still, unmoved. And then, gently, she produced the vial. A blessing for the suffering, she would say. The women understood. They hid the bottle beneath their robes, lowered their heads in prayer, and walked back into the streets of Rome, carrying something far more powerful than faith. The city kept praying, and men kept dying. To anyone watching, they were nothing more than faithful women. They knelt. They prayed. They sought comfort beneath vaulted ceilings and watchful saints. No one imagined that when they rose from the pews, they carried death folded into their sleeves. This arrangement was perfection itself. If authorities ever questioned her, Giulia could retreat behind sacred law and claim sanctuary. If accusations surfaced, she could point to her devotion, her alms, her charity, her constant presence at Mass. And the women? The hundreds who had taken her bottles, who had survived because of them, they would never speak. They couldn't. They had inherited fortunes. They had reclaimed lives. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. For years, it worked. Flawlessly. Giulia Tofana existed beyond reach, guarded by the church, concealed by silence, unseen by the law. But invisibility is never absolute. There was one man who began to see her shadow, Dr. Domenico Catani, a man of reason in an era still ruled by superstition. He had studied at respected universities, treated Rome's most powerful families, and built his reputation on solving illnesses other physicians could not. But lately, he was failing. Over the years, he had been summoned again and again to the bedsides of dying men. Merchants, nobles, bankers, always the same progression. Headaches, nausea, then fever, Weakness. A slow wasting. Katani tried everything. Bloodletting. Purgatives. Herbal drafts. Diets. Prayers disguised as medicine. Nothing worked. The men always died. At first, he blamed the air, the humors, God. But as the deaths accumulated, doubt crept in. Patterns do not belong to God. They belong to humans. Every victim had been married. Everyone healthy before the illness struck. And in nearly every case, the wife was unervingly calm. Not hysterical. Not shattered. Prepared. One case refused to leave his mind. A nobleman in his 40s, strong and well-traveled, fell ill. Shortly after returning from abroad, Katani examined him repeatedly. Found nothing. Yet the decline was relentless. What unsettled him most was the wife. She insisted on preparing every meal herself. Refused servants entry to the sickroom. I must tend to him personally, she said, eyes lowered in practiced devotion. It is my duty. The man died 2 weeks later. Katani stood among the mourners as the widow accepted condolences. And then he saw it. Not sorrow. Relief. Pure and unmistakable. As if a crushing weight had finally been lifted. The sight chilled him. He began asking questions, quietly. He spoke to other physicians. They had noticed it too. Too many men. Too many similar deaths. Too many wives who recovered far too quickly. But suspicion without evidence was suicide. Accusing a noblewoman of murder could ruin a career or end a life. Katani needed proof. To find it, he needed a body. The opportunity came with the death of a wealthy banker. The circumstances were familiar, but this time, the dead man's adult son refused to accept it. Suspicious of his stepmother and her eagerness to claim the estate, he demanded an autopsy. Such a request was almost unheard of. Dissecting a body was considered desecration, an offense against God. But grief sharpened his resolve. And so, reluctantly, the examination was ordered. Dr. Katani was chosen to perform it. The body lay on a rough wooden table beneath the church. The air was thick with decay. Katani ignored it. He opened the chest. The organs told a strange story. The heart was exhausted. The lungs weakened. The liver failing. But not diseased. It was as if the body had been dismantled from within. Then he examined the stomach. And froze. Along the lining were darkened lesions, scorched and corroded. Burns. This was not illness. This was intrusion. Poison. The word lingered in the air, heavy and dangerous. Katani straightened slowly, staring down at the corpse. This man had not died by God's hand. One had helped him. And somewhere in Rome, someone was very, very careful. The hunt had begun. This was not illness. This was murder. And if one man had been taken this way, how many others had followed him into the dark? Dr. Domenico Katani understood the danger of what he had uncovered. So he wrote carefully, precisely. His report avoided accusation. He did not name the widow. He did not speculate beyond what his eyes and hands had proven. But the meaning was unmistakable. This man had been killed deliberately, slowly, by a substance designed to leave almost nothing behind. The document was delivered to the authorities. And for the first time, the invisible sickness tormenting Rome was given a name. Poison. Armed with Katani's findings, Rome's officials began to move. Slowly, cautiously. Investigating poison in the 17th century was like hunting a ghost. There were no laboratories, no tests, no science capable of naming what could not be seen. And the women who knew the truth were bound together by fear, loyalty, and survival. The case did not break because of brilliance. It broke because of guilt. A woman named Girolama Spara lay dying. Her skin burned with fever. Her breath came shallow and uneven. No remedy eased her suffering. She was no ordinary widow. She was one of Giulia Tofana's most trusted lieutenants. A distributor. A messenger. A keeper of secrets. For years, she had sold the poison to desperate women. For years, she had grown wealthy from it. But now, as death closed in, something cracked. In the Catholic faith, the final confession was sacred, the last chance to cleanse the soul before judgment. And Girolamo Spara was terrified of what awaited her beyond the veil. She summoned a priest. He arrived expecting familiar sins. Envy, gossip, pride. What he heard instead shattered him. Her voice trembled as she confessed. She spoke of the poison, of the bottles disguised as blessings, of the wives who used it, of the men who died. Hundreds. She named names, explained methods, mapped the network. And at the center of it all, she spoke one name. Giulia Tofana. The priest was bound by sacred law. He could not repeat her confession, but he could do something else. He urged her to confess publicly, to seek justice on earth as well as mercy in heaven. Girolamo agreed. Knowing she would not live to see the consequences, she gave a formal statement. And with her final breaths, she shattered decades of silence. The hunt exploded across Rome. Armed with Girolamo's confession, the authorities moved fast. Homes were raided in the dead of night. Women were dragged into the streets. Drawers were torn open. Bottles of so-called holy water were seized. Examined. Compared. The pattern was undeniable. And under threat of torture, every arrested woman pointed to the same source. The same architect, Giulia Tofana. Before dawn, soldiers surrounded the church of Santa Maria in Portico. Every exit was blocked. The lead officer marched down the aisle, armor echoing against sacred stone, and demanded the priest surrender her. But Giulia was already there, kneeling before the cross, hands folded, face peaceful. She rose slowly. I claim sanctuary. This is the house of God. You have no authority here. The officer hesitated. She was right. The law of sanctuary was absolute. The standoff could have lasted weeks. But Giulia had misjudged one thing. She believed the church would protect her. The priest stepped forward, the same one who had heard Girolamo's confession. He looked at Giulia, at the woman he had believed devout, and finally saw the truth beneath the veil. He turned to the officer. Take her. God offers refuge to sinners, but not to the devil himself. The soldiers moved. Chains closed around her wrists. Giulia Tofana, the poison priestess, the unseen executioner of hundreds, was finally captured. But arrest was only the beginning. What would they find in her workshop? How many bottles? Still waited on shelves, or in homes, or in cups already prepared? And how many women, even now, were adding drops to wine, unaware that their secret had just been exposed? The cell was dark, airless. A single torch burned in the corridor beyond iron bars. Giulia sat on a stone bench, wrists bound. Her fine clothing was torn, soiled, yet her face, even in shadow, remained disturbingly calm. She had been brought beneath the Palazzo del Governatore, the heart of papal justice, the place where confessions were extracted and mercy rarely survived. And now, the woman who sold death would finally be questioned. This was not a prison for thieves or common murderers. This was where the church sent its nightmares. Heretics, witches, enemies of God. And now, Giulia Tofana. In the eyes of Rome, she was all three. The stone walls were damp, carved with scratches, prayers, pleas, and names long forgotten. Here, faith did not comfort. It judged. The man who entered her cell was not an executioner. He did not shout. He did not threaten. His name was Cardinal Orsini, a senior authority of the papal courts, trained not in brutality, but in persuasion. He believed truth could be extracted gently, like a splinter pulled slowly from flesh. He sat across from Giulia and placed a single document on the small wooden table between them. The confession, Girolamo Spara's words, written proof of an empire built on silence and poison. Giulia Tofana, he said, you are accused of the deaths of more than 600 men, of heresy, of witchcraft, of conspiring with the devil himself to bring death into Christian homes. He leaned forward slightly. What do you say to these charges? Giulia met his gaze. Dark eyes, sharp, unafraid. She did not tremble. She did not cry. She spoke as if commenting on the weather. I have killed no one. I am a widow who sells cosmetics and remedies. If women used my products in ways I did not intend, how is that my crime? It was elegant. A blade wrapped in silk. Distance the hand from the act. Blame the user. Claim innocence through ignorance. Orsini's expression hardened. Do not insult me. His voice sharpened, but did not rise. We have testimony. Bottles. Letters. Receipts. We know what Aqua Tofana is. We know what it does. He paused. And we know you created it. Giulia said nothing. She simply watched him. Then Orsini asked the question he believed would break her. Did you feel nothing for the men who died? Their families? Their children? Their souls? For the first time, something moved behind her eyes. Not guilt. Not fear. Something colder. Did their families think of the women they destroyed? She said quietly. The words fell softly and struck like iron. Did they care when those men beat their wives? When they stole their dowries? When they threatened murder for disobedience? She leaned forward now. I gave those women what the law refused them. She paused. I gave them freedom. Orsini leaned back, shaken. This was not repentance. It was conviction. You call death freedom, he said. I call it choice, she replied. In a world where women have none. The interrogation continued for hours. But Giulia spoke no further. She had defined herself, not as a murderer, but as a liberator, and no argument would move her from that belief. Orsini left the cell and returned to his superiors with a grim conclusion. Giulia would not confess. She would not repent, and she would not name the women who still walked free. If the church wanted the full truth, there was only one option left. The final instrument of persuasion. The question. The torture chamber lay deep beneath the papal prisons. A room of stone and iron, cold and deliberate, engineered for despair. Instruments waited in silence. The rack, the strappado, the wheel. Their very names were sermons of terror. The church did not call this cruelty. It called it mercy. Pain was framed as salvation, breaking the body to save the soul. Giulia was led inside in chains. The door closed behind her. Torchlight danced across iron hooks and blood-darkened wood. She stood alone in the center of the chamber, calm, unbowed, unrepentant. And now, the church would test whether conviction could survive agony. The men who entered the chamber wore dark robes and blank expressions. They did not rage. They did not threaten. They worked with the precision of clerks balancing accounts. Before a single rope was touched, they offered her mercy. One last chance. Confess fully. Name every woman. Expose every corner of the network. Giulia Tofana said nothing. So they began. The strappado was brutally simple. Her wrists were bound behind her back. A rope looped tight and thrown over a beam. And then she was lifted. Her feet left the ground. Her entire weight dragged down on her shoulders. Pain exploded through her body. Joints tore free. Muscle fibers screamed and ruptured. Most people broke within moments. Giulia did not. She hung there, suspended like a sacrifice. Sweat streamed down her face. Her jaw clenched until blood filled her mouth. The torturers waited. Silence stretched. And then she spoke. But not the words they wanted. You want names? She gasped. Look to your palaces. Look to the wives of cardinals and princes. Look to the women who kneel beside you in church. Her voice shook, but it did not break. They are everywhere, and you will never find them all. Even in agony, she resisted. They lowered her to the stone floor and gave her time to breathe, time to reconsider. But Giulia understood something they did not. She was already condemned. No confession would save her. The only choice left was how much damage she would allow them to do. The torture continued, method after method, pain layered upon pain. And slowly, deliberately, Giulia began to speak. Not because her will had collapsed, because she calculated. She offered them enough. Names of the dead, names of those already captured, Girolamo Spara, others who could no longer be harmed, victims the church already possessed. But the living? The women who had survived, who now lived free lives beyond Rome's reach. Those names remained sealed. No scream unlocked them. No blade reached them. It was her final protection, her last act of loyalty. When it was over, the authorities had what they required. Not the whole truth, but sufficient truth. Enough to justify judgment. Enough to deliver a sentence. Enough to create a warning that would echo for centuries. July 1659. The trial of Giulia Tofana, held in the great hall of the papal court. It was anything but quiet. Word had spread like fire. Across Rome, across Italy, across Europe. The woman who had ended hundreds of lives with a clear liquid had become legend and nightmare. The hall overflowed. Nobles pressed shoulder to shoulder with merchants. Clergy stood beside common laborers. They had not come for justice. They had come to see the monster. Giulia was brought in under guard. She no longer resembled the composed figure who once moved through churches like a saint. Her body bore the cost of the dungeon. Her clothing hung in tatters. But her eyes remained sharp, aware, unbroken. The charges were read, one by one. Murder, heresy, conspiracy, witchcraft. Each accusation struck like a hammer. The prosecutor rose, eloquent and ruthless. He described a woman who had bargained with darkness, a corrupter of homes, a servant of evil disguised as devotion. He spoke of husbands and fathers laid low, of men who died gasping while their wives watched. Then he lifted the bottles, glass adorned with saints and angels, proof of deception. These crimes are so vast, so terrible, they rival the plague sent by God himself. The hall erupted in murmurs. All eyes returned to Giulia. She stood in chains, silent, watching. Judgment was inevitable. But how Rome would end this story, and what message it would carve into history, was yet to be decided. She has turned wives into widows, children into orphans, and homes into tombs. She has mocked marriage, defied God, and poisoned the very foundations of Christian life. The courtroom seethes. Faces twist with revulsion. Hands clench rosaries. Anger spreads like a fever through the hall. The crowd murmurs its approval, a living organism hungry for condemnation. Then, silence. It is her turn. Giulia Tofana is not given counsel. No advocate speaks for her. She stands alone. She rises slowly, iron links scraping against stone, and faces the court. Her body is broken. Her clothes are torn. Her voice is steady. I am guilty. The confession ripples through the hall like an earthquake. But she does not stop. I am guilty of giving women a choice. I am guilty of offering freedom to those who had none. Her gaze sweeps the room. You call it murder. I call it mercy. The murmurs return, louder now. She presses on. You speak of the sanctity of marriage. Where was that sanctity when husbands broke bones instead of vows? Where was God when women were treated as property, traded, beaten, discarded? Her voice does not shake. I did not create the evil inside those homes. I gave women the power to end it. The courtroom erupts. Men shout. Voices snarl words like witch, demon, servant of hell. But beneath the chaos, softer and almost imperceptible, women murmur. Not all in anger. Some in recognition. Silence is forced back into the room. Giulia Tofana. You have confessed to crimes against God and man. You show no remorse, no repentance. You have taken sacred knowledge and forged it into a weapon of death. The pause that follows is suffocating. The sentence of this court is clear. You are condemned to death. You will be executed publicly, so all may witness the fate of those who defy God's law. May your soul find the mercy in death that you denied to so many in life. The crowd explodes. Cheers, shouts, prayers twisted into celebration. Guards seize Giulia and drag her toward the shadows. But before she disappears, she turns. You think my death will end this? The hall stills. The poison already sits in 100 homes, in 1,000 bottles. You cannot stop what has already begun. And then she is gone, swallowed by stone corridors, leaving behind a room full of people who suddenly feel unsafe in their own houses. 3 days later, the execution is announced. Piazza di Ponte Sant'Angelo, a public square near the Vatican. A platform is erected. fresh timber, a single noose suspended in open air. This is not justice. It is theater, a warning written in rope. The square floods with thousands. Nobles watch from balconies. Merchants shutter their shops. Parents lift children onto shoulders. A lesson is being taught today, and hidden among the crowd are the women. Widows, wives, daughters, faces still, eyes dry. They do not speak. They do not cry. Giulia Tofana is led onto the platform, hands bound, back straight, head high. The charges are read one final time. A priest steps forward, crucifix extended. One last chance. Giulia studies it. For a fleeting moment, something softens. Not regret. Fatigue. I lived as I believed was right. Now I will die the same way. The priest retreats. The noose is placed. The rope tightens. Giulia looks out over the crowd. And she smiles. Not madness. Not defiance. Recognition. A smile that says, asterisk, I see you. I know you. And you remember me. Asterisk. The lever is pulled. The platform drops. And Giulia Tofana dies in full daylight. But death did not end her story. It began a legend. In the days that followed, authorities tore through Rome. Homes were raided. Bottles seized. Women arrested. Yet the fear lingered. Because for every vial destroyed, how many had already been emptied? And for every woman captured, how many still walked free? History would never agree on what Giulia Tofana truly was. Monster, murderer, or savior. But one truth could not be erased. She proved that even the powerless can change the world, one drop at a time. They believed that killing her would erase everything. They were wrong. The authorities moved with obsession, determined to scour Italy clean of Aqua Tofana, to burn out the roots of the poison forever. What they found terrified them. The poison was everywhere. They discovered bottles tucked inside velvet-lined jewelry boxes in noble estates, and hidden beneath straw mattresses in servants' quarters. They found them in convents, concealed among medicinal stores kept by nuns sworn to obedience and silence. They uncovered handwritten formulas in private journals, copied carefully, passed from mother to daughter like forbidden scripture. Some women, panicked by the raids, hurled their vials into the dark current of the Tiber, watching freedom sink beneath the surface. Others buried them in gardens, beneath fig trees and stone paths. And some, defiant and resolute, kept them, waiting. The authorities were forced to confront a truth more frightening than any single criminal. Giulia Tofana had not exaggerated. Her execution did not end the poison. It was too deeply woven, too widely shared, too essential to the survival of women who had no other escape. And so a question began to whisper through Rome's courts and churches, a question no one could answer. How many more men would die before the last bottle was found? How many more widows would smile in private, knowing what they held? And perhaps most unsettling of all, in the homes of the judges who condemned her, in the palaces of the cardinals who sanctioned her death, were wives and daughters who already possessed their own small vials of so-called holy water. The monster was dead, but the poison lived. Giulia Tofana's death did not bring peace to Italy. It unleashed fear. Paranoia spread like fire through cities and countryside alike. The authorities, now fully aware of the scale of what they faced, launched a ruthless campaign to eradicate every remaining trace of the poison. But in their terror, they abandoned reason. They stopped looking for evidence and started hunting suspects. In the 17th century, suspicion alone could be fatal. The witch hunts began. Widows were seized first, especially those who had inherited wealth. Women who lived alone. Women who practiced healing. Women who knew herbs. Interrogations turned brutal. Torture became routine. Confessions poured out, some real, many torn from bodies under agony. Each confession spawned more accusations, more arrests, more deaths. In Rome alone, more than a dozen women were executed in the months following Giulia's death. Some had truly been part of the network. Others were nothing more than casualties of fear, denounced by neighbors, betrayed by family members hungry for inheritance. The irony was merciless. Women who had escaped male violence through poison were now destroyed by male authority. The same system that had trapped them now hunted them for daring to survive. And yet, for all their cruelty, the authorities could never fully destroy what Giulia had created, because she had not merely sold poison. She had ignited an idea that could not be strangled, could not be hanged, could not be buried. The idea that women did not have to endure forever, that resistance, even in its darkest form, was still resistance. That power, once tasted, could not be forgotten. In the years that followed, the pattern reappeared. Across Europe, quiet deaths, sudden illnesses, widows who recovered too quickly. In France, decades later, a scandal erupted, the affair of the poisons. Noble women, fortune-tellers, alchemists, a shadow economy of death operating beneath the court of King Louis XIV. At its center stood another woman, Lavoisier, running a network eerily similar to Giulia's. Dozens were executed before the scandal was silenced. But the echoes continued. In Spain, in Germany, in Poland, stories of mysterious widows, of herbalists who knew too much, of saint-labeled bottles holding something far darker than blessing. And always, in whispers, in closed rooms, in desperate conversations between women, one name lingered, invoked like a prayer, or a curse. Tofana. The recipe was never written, not in ink, not in ledgers, not in the records of courts or churches. Aqua Tofana survived the only way forbidden knowledge ever does, through mouths, through memory, through women who understood that survival sometimes demanded terrible decisions. It passed in murmurs behind locked doors, in coded phrases folded into letters, in the unbreakable trust of those who knew betrayal meant death. And in that way, Giulia Tofana became something far more dangerous than a criminal. She became a symbol, and symbols cannot be executed. As decades passed and the hysteria cooled, Giulia's story began to change. What had once been scandal hardened into legend. And from that legend emerged a question that still refuses to rest. Was Giulia Tofana a monster or a hero? The truth, as always, is deeply uncomfortable. On one side, the facts. Unavoidable. Brutal. She created a poison. She distributed it deliberately. Women used it to kill their husbands. More than 600 men died. These were not accidents. They were planned, methodical. And no matter the motive, taking a human life remains one of the darkest acts imaginable. That truth cannot be softened. But the other side of the scale refuses to be ignored. The women who came to Giulia were not thrill-seekers. They were trapped. They lived in a world where the law offered them nothing, where abuse was invisible, where marriage was a cage with no key. A husband could beat his wife and face no punishment. He could steal her dowry and the law would shrug. He could rape her and it was called his right. The church preached endurance. The state enforced silence. Society demanded obedience. Suffering was not a flaw in the system. It was the system. Giulia Tofana did not create that cruelty. She exploited the void it left behind. She offered an option where none existed. Not justice, but escape. And for many of those women, escape was worth any price. This is the contradiction at the heart of her story. Giulia was both symptom and cause, a response to violence, and a perpetrator of violence. She did not heal the disease. She poisoned it. So what do we call her? A vigilante? A serial killer? A dark feminist icon? A demon? A saint? Perhaps she was all of them. Perhaps she was none. Perhaps the only honest answer is the simplest and the most disturbing. Giulia Tofana saw suffering, and she offered a solution. That solution was poison. Whether that makes her a savior or a monster depends entirely on which side of the bottle you were standing on. Her story did not die with her. It transformed. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Giulia became a warning, a cautionary tale told to women who dared imagine independence. She was painted as a witch, a seductress, a servant of Satan who lured obedient wives into damnation. Fear was the lesson, but time has a way of re-examining its monsters. In the 20th and 21st centuries, scholars, especially feminist historians, returned to her story and saw something else. Resistance. Women fighting back against a system designed to crush them. Giulia Tofana emerged as a dark icon of female defiance, proof that even in the most brutal eras, women found ways to reclaim power. Her poison entered fiction, plays, novels, television. Her name surfaced in discussions of crime, gender, and the long, uneasy relationship between poison and power. And the question she leaves behind, how far is too far? Can violence ever be justified in pursuit of freedom? Remains painfully relevant. Giulia Tofana ended 600 lives, and she freed 600 women. Between those two truths lies a moral wound history has never fully healed. But one mystery still remains. One secret she carried with her to the grave. Despite arrests, despite torture, despite trials and executions, the formula for Aqua Tofana was never found. No official record, no definitive recipe, only whispers, and the unsettling possibility that somewhere, sometime, someone remembered it. The authorities seized what they could. Bottles were collected, liquids examined, residues studied with the crude science of the age. But it was never enough. They could identify that something had killed. They could guess what families of substances were involved. But the precision, the balance, the method that made the poison so silent, so patient, so flawless, that knowledge vanished with Giulia Tofana. Or so they believed. Because centuries later, people are still looking. In forgotten libraries, in sealed archives, in the private notebooks of alchemists, healers, and poisoners. Historians search for answers. Chemists test old theories. True crime scholars trace symptoms across time. And every so often, a story emerges. A death medicine cannot explain. A slow decline. Headaches. Weakness. A wasting that mirrors the testimonies of the 17th century. A widow who seems prepared. Too prepared. And the question returns like a ghost. Could it be? Could the formula have survived? Could Aqua Tofana, the invisible weapon, still exist? We will never know for certain. But in that uncertainty, the legend breathes. Giulia Tofana's story resists simplicity. She cannot be reduced to a single word, a single verdict. She was a criminal and a liberator, a murderer and a savior, a monster and a hero, all at once. The truth of her life exists in the tension between those extremes. What is certain is this: in a world where women had no voice, no legal protection, no escape, Giulia Tofana gave them a weapon. And with that weapon, they altered their lives. 600 men died. 600 women walked free. And history, quietly and irrevocably, shifted. Her legacy is not written in law books. It survives in quiet rebellions, in desperate decisions made behind locked doors, in the eternal struggle between power and powerlessness. So now, the question passes to you. What do you believe? Was Giulia Tofana history's most effective female serial killer? Or a dark angel of mercy in a merciless world? A monster who deserved her fate? Or a product of a society so brutal that it left no other choice? Is the bottle poison? Or medicine? Death? Or liberation? Perhaps the answer depends entirely on where you stand, and which side of the bottle you were on. If this journey into history's shadows made you question what you thought you knew, share your thoughts. We explore forgotten stories, buried truths, and the dark corners time tries to hide. Until next time, remember, the most dangerous weapons are often the ones you cannot see.